And welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, we are 10 days away to the G20 in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou. We are building an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy will be the top of this year's agenda. How can China, together with others, pave the way forward? And we sit down for an interview with the leading faces of the G20 girls on their efforts to give young women across the world a voice and what the international community can do to pitch in. Can change happen? Very soon. This is World Insight, and we begin today's show with the upcoming G20 summit 10 days from now. It will be held in the Chinese city of Hangzhou. Chinese President Xi Jinping will give a keynote speech at the opening ceremony and chair the summit. Hangzhou is in full gear for the event, and China, as the world's second largest economy, is ready to provide a solution to the global economic growth. Before our in-depth discussion, let's take a look at this.
For the first time, innovation will be a discussion topic for the G20 summit. On Wednesday, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences issued reports on innovation, competitiveness, and the economic drivers of the G20 economies. The chief executive editor for the reports says they aim to help the summit participants discover how to harness their advantages for technological innovation.
After the global financial crisis in 2008, most of the countries have started to place their hopes of economic recovery on technological innovation. So what we are doing right now is to help the G20 economies find out the advantages and weaknesses of their technological innovation development, help them solve those problems, and consolidate their current achievements in the area.
Now, with 10 days before the G20 summit in Hangzhou, China has started the countdown to the big event. China's foreign ministry on Wednesday confirmed the attendance of world leaders to the Hangzhou summit. Leaders such as U.S. President Barack Obama, the U.K.'s Prime Minister Theresa May, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin will participate in the summit. Meanwhile, leaders of international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund will also be present. Also, this year's G20 summit in China will see more leaders from developing countries than before.
Voices of developing countries will be fully heard at the G20 summit.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi expressed confidence over the success of the G20 summit during his visit to Japan.
China has realized its obligations and responsibilities as the host. We are making final preparations, and the summit's key achievements have been locked in. This summit could become the most fruitful one so far.
Building an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy. This is the theme of this year's G20 summit. Experts say the world's economic recovery has been slow. How to establish more effective ways to resist financial risk and promote free trade will likely dominate this year's G20 summit agenda.
And for more on this, we are joined in the Beijing studio, Professor Fu Jun from the National School of Development at Peking University. And also in Washington, D.C., joining us, Mr. Paulo Mauro, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Joining us also from Nairobi, we are having Mr. Ali Khan Sachu, who is a CEO of Rich Management and East African Portal, also SSA economic and geopolitical analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. We are having a 10-day countdown to the G20. Of course, it's a big thing for China as the host country. Professor Fu, how do the Chinese people see this, the upcoming G20?
Well, it's a big thing, and well, as far as the government is concerned, they have been preparing this for a long time. As I know, they started the process of preparation since December last year, and incidentally, Hangzhou is my hometown. I love the city, regardless whether we have the meeting or not. I love this town. It's a long history. And Marco Polo visited China. He said it's one of the best cities in the world. And there is a phrase in China that says, above you have heavens, and below you have Hangzhou and Suzhou. But in terms of preparation for this meeting, the agenda is set, the facilities will be first rate.
Well, the facilities will be first rate, and you are making the other two gentlemen very jealous about saying, under the heaven, that is the best place to go. But let me ask you, Mr. Paulo, seriously, there are so many things on the agenda, yet we are having a lot of players, both the G20 economies, observing countries coming from developing, emerging, and also developed economies, and also international organizations, including the UN as well. So many players crammed into one specific building. Will they able to come up with something?
Well, we of course expect that they will come up with a concluding statement, and sometimes that's very substantive, sometimes it's a little bit more perfunctory. This is a type of meeting that happens on a regular basis. I expect that there will be some new initiatives. My hope is that there will be something about infrastructure investment and facilitating that infrastructure investment around the world. Of course, it's hard to know the specifics at this time, but the world needs more investment in infrastructure, and there are new international institutions. There's a lot of need for investment around the world because private investment is lagging, and that at this point is a drag on economic growth. So
right.
A push from the G20 would be extremely helpful at this time.
Mr. Sartru, coming from the African perspective, this is the very first time that many of the developing economies have been consulted. According to China, they have consulted the G77, they have consulted the least developing countries, and also they have consulted the African Union. So obviously, developing countries, their concern is going to be one of the center themes. But given the diversity of the countries and players, will developing countries be able to push their agenda? Will this become another battleground, as we have seen in the climate change discussion, for example?
Very interesting. I think, the first point to make is that the fact that the lesser developed countries, and Africa in particular, have been included, ties into the four I's of this G20 conference: innovation, invigoration, interconnectedness, and inclusion. So I think it's really important Africa's at the table. I think it's a good signal that the Chinese have Africa front and center in their mind. Now, Africa has entered a different period, much slower growth. This year will be the slowest rate of GDP expansion since the early 1990s. It's 2 decades we've had of expansion. This is the slowest rate. So I think there is an African agenda. That African agenda is an important one, and it's all about supporting growth. And I think, China has been for a long time a very strong supporter of Africa and the African continent. And I think it's an opportunity for Xi Jinping and the Chinese government to come forward and show what can be done in this slower growth, more difficult environment. So yes, I'm glad we're there. I expect our agenda to be on the table. And I think, at this point in time, we're looking for more assistance out of the developed countries.
Very interesting. You see, Professor Fu, everybody their own specific issues to be taken care of. But we shouldn't forget this is the G20. 20 economies should contribute to the pool of wisdom, and they should also make sure there will be implementations if they ever reach anything. Will that happen given the current state of the economies?
My argument is that there will be better coordination among big powers, because when the world economy is slowing down, countries will be engaged in counter-cyclical measures, specifically monetary fiscal policy. But without good policy coordination, it's problematic. So short term, you need to pop up the world economy.
What kind of coordination? In what area
for
is
instance,
coordination?
Exchange rates. You're going up or going down, then it will have capital flows, and it would be better for big powers to have coordination. Otherwise, the world economy will be in worse shape. Then you have to think of intermediate long-term things. Now, for the world economy to move forward, you are looking at 2 sets of productivity increase. One is better governance, such that you have better allocated resources. The African friends were talking about slower growth in African countries, but if you project growth years down the road, countries in the southern part of the world, South-South cooperation, those countries will have higher growth rates. After all, growth is a function of land and labor. If you inject capital and the longer term,
so governance.
Innovation.
What about the others?
Technology. Technology is long term. Ultimately, it's technology that will power long-term economic growth.
Well, Professor Fu, I have to say that many of the key words you mentioned have been mentioned a million times over the past few years, and yet we have not seen real agenda, real implementation. Mr. Maulo, no wonder people and economies are talking about transformation. They talk about all of the key words Professor Fu just mentioned to us, but when it comes to real plan, coordinated plan, we haven't seen much. Even though there could be some plan, we haven't seen much implementation due to one reason or the other. Mr. Paolo, will this be different? That will be my question.
Well, it's hard to know. I don't expect much difference in the area of monetary policy. I think countries will keep doing what is best for them from their domestic point of view most of the time. For fiscal policies, I expect that there will be some calls for more stimulus, but I don't expect that there will be a lot of movement there. I think there will be the usual calls on countries such as Germany, possibly Korea, to do a little bit more stimulus, but I just don't see that that's going to happen. I think what's more likely to happen is that there will be a push towards tilting fiscal spending towards infrastructure, and that makes a lot of sense because interest rates are very low. I think also what would be most beneficial is an agreement on fostering long-term infrastructure. I have a forthcoming book called World on the Move that estimates that over the next 20 years, spending on transportation in India, China, and several other emerging economies will quadruple. Almost quadruple as well in sub-Saharan Africa if growth holds up, and we need to find mechanisms to finance that investment. And also we need to find
Mr. Maulo, before you go further, may I just jump in by asking you, many of the remedies you have just raised also belong to the old camps. Let's just put in more investment into the infrastructure, burn the cash, and let's have more consumption. But many say, will these old tools be able to help us to find real remedy for today's problem, particularly when it comes to capacity building, when it comes to transformation of the economies?
Well, the evidence, people become richer, they change the types of spending. They spend less on food and they spend more on transportation. So it is a natural development that people will spend more on travel, and in order to accommodate that very real demand, we need to build new railways, we need to build new roads, and we need to do that in a way that fosters investment that is friendly to climate change. So we want to make sure that that's tilted towards networks in cities, and this needs to be financed, and we can give financial incentives so that the right types of infrastructure are built.
Mr. Sarchu, do you think infrastructure building will save the world's economy? And where does the money come from? Come from China?
So I think, we're in a very interesting place right now in the world economy. We've got negative interest rates, which speaks to an extraordinary situation. We've got all kinds of things happening in the developed countries. And the question is, we've got monetary easing, which is really la-la land economics. So it's a very distorted world. I accept that. And in Africa's case, for a long time, China has been a huge liquidity provider, in particular in terms of doing the infrastructure. And I continue to see Africa playing a big role. But I'm concerned that we're now entering a new economic normal, one where volatility has spiked, where I feel that a lot of monetary policy has been pushing on a string. I think we've really got to look at what is productive and what can be done in order to invigorate the economy. I don't see more money printing in the developed economies helping in this scenario at all. I think we've got to look for some kind of new model. I'm not sure that we have the silver bullet or the new model has come into sight yet. I think many people are trying to adjust with the current economic conditions, China included, as it evolves in this very important period of time. So I think what's going to be interesting for me from the G20 as well is going to be how China articulates what it's doing, the role it's going to play in this new environment as well.
How China is playing its role, how China will play its role. What aspirations does China have? Others, as Mr. Xia Chu said, are looking at China.
Well, the title of this summit meeting is Four Eyes: Innovation, Invigoration, Interconnectedness, Inclusiveness. To elaborate on those eyes, for instance, to start with inclusiveness, the world economy has developed in such a shape that you have few people who are rich, many are poor.
Okay,
but
what about China's
if you
approach?
only have the
China's
supply
approach.
side,
Let's just talk about China's
I will
approach.
talk about China's approach later on. When you have many who are poor, you do not have demand. So there, China's approach is we propose to propose the idea of one belt, one road. That specific is infrastructure. You roll out infrastructure, but to finance the infrastructure, you need money. So China proposed, as already set into operation, the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, and deeper than that.
So you are saying it is also infrastructure. You're saying infrastructure is going to save the world.
No, infrastructure is one bullet. There have to be other bullets.
What are the other bullets?
How to finance
What
that.
about systematic changes, systematic
finance,
bullets?
you're talking about finance. Finance, one part of the finance, you put money into the real economy. Other is you just leverage it up. And if you look at today's world, you probably have too higher level of leverage rather than serious investment putting into long-term growth. And there is more fundamental level. It's transfer of knowledge to learn from each other. And China has decided to set up, for instance, at Peking University, an institute called South-South Cooperation and Development, and to learn from each other among developing countries.
Talking about that magical silver bullet, Mr. Xia Chu, some suggest, could that be innovation? But of course, it depends on the meaning of innovation, what we are talking about. And could that also be governance? But that also depends on what kind of governance we are talking about. Mr. Xia Chu, from your perspective.
You're completely correct. I mean, you know, we've got to look at things like governance. It's absolutely key, and we're clearly finding that in Africa. You know, you look at some countries where there's been very poor governance, and the question is, how do we create an architecture which creates better governance across the world? And I think we desperately need a better corporate governance structure around the institutions, the G3, the G7, the G20, the participation of BRICS in these big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and then a positive spillover into the developed world where we can reap benefits from better corporate governance. I think, you know, if you look in Africa in particular, we're seeing a number of economies, the big beasts of the African economies. You know, if you look at Nigeria, you look at South Africa, you look at Mozambique, and you can see that, you know, we've come to the end of the road with the existing structure. We are going to have to change that, and I think China plays a big role in how the next leg of the China-Africa, the Africa story plays out.
Okay.
And I think also from China's point of view, I think we've had regime change in terms of China's relationship with Africa. I think it was very freewheeling. You had characters like Sampa, but you got a much more focused approach now under President Xi Jinping. And I think for Africa, Africa also has to be cognizant of that change. How it all plays out is going to be fluid, and we're going to see it all develop. But definitely it's got to change, because some of these models, these old commodity models where you just dug it out of the ground, you exported, and the money fell from the sky, that day's over. We can see that. And it also has an impact on China, because China was a very big lender to these economies, whether it was Venezuela, whether it was Angola. And I think they too are reluctant now to throw more money after that sort of that sort of transaction. We're going to see a recalibration across the Chinese-African relationship.
Well, having said about China-Africa relations, what about China-U.S. Economic ties? Mr. Mauro, you are based in Washington, D.C. Where is it going to go for new development possibilities?
Right. Well, I think that it is crucial that the economic and political relationships continue, not only between the United States and China, but globally. So, of course, there are relations between the two largest economies, but I think there's also relations worldwide that need to continue to be fostered. We've heard a lot of rhetoric in the direction of more protectionism, more sort of taking care of American interests as opposed to the interests of the global economy. My hope and expectation, frankly, is that the good relations will continue and will be enhanced, hoping that the protectionist voices will not succeed, and meetings such as the G20 actually are one way in which global economic cooperation continues and is fostered. Of course, they're most effective also from a political point of view when something is achieved in terms of concrete economic agreements. So I'm hopeful that they will come up with something concrete that can be used to show that cooperation is successful.
We'll see whether that would happen. It really depends on, Professor Fu, whether people, countries, interest players bring ideas to the table. If they just sit there and wait for the others to bring up the consensus, that's never going to be any consensus eventually. What do you think can be the idea thrown around during their discussions? Eventually that can bear some fruits.
Well, if you look at the titles of those sessions, this gives you a rough idea of what will transpire, even though seemingly those are economic ideas, but the reality is that the world economy is a political economy, so there will be political voices as well. The head of a state coming together sends a very powerful political signal.
Right.
At least there are levels of unity among those nations to talk to each other. And you are talking about the role of big countries, United States, China. If you look at the big picture of the world economic, the engine of the world, the continuation of China's urbanization and also the provision of technology from the United States will continue to empower the world economy by and large. And do not forget the picture of climate change.
Right.
In the absence of a global government, United States and China have to be there to lead the fight against the climate change. So there is absolutely no question that the two big powers have to sit down and talk and to continue to lead.
All right, we hope that the political leaders from the G20 economies will be able to fulfill their responsibilities this time. Thank you so much, Professor Fu Jun, Mr. Paulo Mauro, and also Mr. Ali Khan Saju. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. We sit down for an interview with the G20 girls on their efforts to give a voice to the unheard women of the world and what governments of today can do to help. Can we make the world a better and equal place? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. While we wait for the G20 Leaders Summit to kick off, some interesting events also closely related to the G20 are taking place. Among them is Girls 20, dedicated to young women from the G20 economies. In G20 Leaders Summit style, the Girls 20 Summit brings together delegates of the G20 economies who want their voices be heard by G20 leaders and also cultivate a new generation of female leaders. This year, the Girls 20 Summit was held in Beijing, and we were able to capture some of the fresh, energetic voices there. Let's meet them, starting from the organizer, Farah Muhammad. So Farah, tell me about this program. Why do you get 20 girls from G20 countries every year before the summit?
Well, you know, we live in a world where there are people who make decisions, and those decisions, for the most part, 2/3 of the world's population are the G20. And so we thought about 7 years ago that if we wanted to really engage the G20 to understand what their biggest resource was going to be, we need to put girls and women center. So we created the Girls 20. We basically stole the idea of the G20, and we brought girls along. And what we have proven is that if you invest in girls, if you give them skills, if you give them opportunities, you allow them to create ideas, then the G20 leaders, mostly they're men, they can draw from those ideas and actually make investments in communities. And that's what the Girls 20 really does. It's got two folks. We want to talk to the G20 leaders, and at the same time we want to create a new form of leadership, a new number of leaders in the form of girls.
Well, you know, among G20 economies, they're at very different development stage. There are developing countries, emerging economies, there are also developed ones, and they have their own political and social challenges as well. So when these girls are together, do they have common topics?
Well, you know, I'll let them speak for themselves, but I'll tell you, I get to sit in the room a little bit, and I will tell you there are three major things that I see. One, we have people in the room who do come from very different backgrounds. Some will have never been on a plane before. Some will have traveled around the world. We put together a diverse group because that is the world in which we live. We don't live next to people who are only like us anymore. The world has changed. And so when we pick these young women, we do it with the mind of, let's create the dynamic where they will have some things in common, but they may have a lot that is not in common. And that's where the magic happens. That's where the ideas flow. That's where they fight for what they believe in.
Yeah.
And that's what we want. And that's actually what happens at the G20 table. You don't have the prime ministers and the presidents all agree on stuff. In fact, they argue for what they believe in. Now, the magic of the G20 and the magic of the Girls 20 is that they will put together a communique. And that communique is not meant to say, Canada will do this, Japan will do that. It's meant to say, here is the picture. Now do what you can with that picture so it's customized in your own country.
Very interesting. And you talk about them in the circumstances that they have never been before. Yes. So let me go to them to hear the real voices coming from the girls. Maybe you want to help us to understand where you're from, what's your name, and what do you think is the major achievements that you have done through this program?
My name is Xinyu Hong. I'm from China. I just graduated from Renmin University of China, and I want to start a education incubator in China to help balance the education resources.
And what about you?
My name is Pippa. I'm the delegate from Canada. I guess one of my biggest achievements from before is I started an initiative called Students for Special Olympics, where I provided sports programming for kids with intellectual disabilities. I intend to facilitate skill-building workshops to build self-esteem and self-confidence in adolescent girls. I think girls, young girls these days have a pretty hard time with social media in this day and age.
What do you mean? It's supposed to be helpful, right? Social media.
Well, I think we're faced with an enough problem where girls think they're not pretty enough, they're not smart enough, not popular enough. And when they go on Instagram and they see a highlight reel of everyone's glamorous things that they're doing, you're constantly comparing yourself to an unrealistic picture. And I have a younger sister who's in high school, and I see her and I see her friend group, and they're very, very self-critical. And I know that it's a huge problem, so that's where I'd like to chip in and reinvest.
But if I were the headmaster of the middle school or high school, I would ask you, why would I have you to build the self-esteem of the young women in my school? Because probably there are people much more qualified than you.
And there are, but I think a strength that I have is I was in their position not too long ago. 5 years ago, I was in their spot, and I know the challenges that high school is. But part of my initiative is also bringing in experienced female professionals to come in and speak and share their experience in their industry and different fields of profession. So I think tag teaming and having a younger representative but also somebody more senior will help bridge the gap.
What about you?
My name is Annika and I'm representing Germany. I'm from Berlin, but I study in Heidelberg. What I'm going to do when I come back to my country is I'm going to start an awareness campaign which should destigmatize depression and which focuses on the importance of mental health and about talking, and the importance of talking about mental health.
Why is that so dear to your heart?
Because I think, especially also among young people, it's becoming less of a stigma. So young people are starting to talk about it, but still, especially in Germany and also in a few other countries, some countries have made more progress, it's still a topic that's not talked about and that has a big stigma attached to it. And so that's why I think it's so important that we talk about it.
And now, let's just imagine we could have a chance to face the leaders of the G20 economies. When they come off from their big meetings, they open their door, 20 of them facing you guys. What is the sentence or the thing that you really want to say to them?
Increase those entrepreneurship training and funding in community-based organizations so that we can offer them trainings and fundings, all kind of education resources that they need with different education backgrounds.
Equality that we're talking about, equal access to resources.
Yes.
Extremely smart. What about you, Canada?
Yeah, I think the government should financially incentivize the private sector to increase the female participation on boards, so that being board of directors and among corporations, because it's well researched that when there's a 50% of females on boards, the company tends to do 30% better. So there's significant economic gain in that.
All right, and what about you, from Germany?
I'm going to argue that governments should invest more in mental health services in order to increase productivity and also female labor force participation.
Farah?
I guess I would say, look, in 2014 you made a commitment. It was a very clear commitment that you would create 100 million new jobs by 2025. We're 3 years in. Where are we? What have you done to actually get to that goal? We need to see the data, we need to see the measurement, and we need to make sure that we're tracking to progress. And they can't just make commitments without actually doing something to realize those commitments. That's what I would say. We need to see the proof.
Women leadership is rising around the world. The US is watching Hillary Clinton, the first female presidential nominee to head a major political part, lead in the opinion polls in the presidential election campaign. In Europe, German Chancellor Angela Merkel once again topped Forbes' list of 100 most powerful women. Merkel became the leader of Germany in 2005 and has dominated the ranking for the past 6 years. In the UK, the new female Prime Minister, Theresa May, is facing the challenge of Brexit after David Cameron resigned as leader. Meanwhile, more male leaders are showing their support for women. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau openly expressed that he is a feminist. Last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech on enhancing gender equality at the UN's Global Leaders meeting. Many women believe the trend of gender equality is creating a golden era for women worldwide.
You're fortunate. So what do you make of this rise of female leadership, the rise of gender parity in the central policies around the world these days? Is it going to be sustainable? What do you think you can do to contribute to that? Let's go with the Canadian girls.
Yes, well, I'm very proud to come from Canada. As you may know, Prime Minister Trudeau just elected the first ever gender equal cabinet. So we have 15 extraordinary female cabinet ministers and 15 equally as qualified male ministers. And I think that's indicative of the trend where Canada is going, but also it's set an example for the rest of the world. And you know what? The rest of the world is looking. And I wouldn't be surprised in a couple of years that other countries will follow suit. What's interesting in the UK, they have another female prime minister. We're looking to the States. They may have the first ever female president.
Okay, I know which party you're working for or voting for if you are American.
Try to hide my colors a little bit more. But yeah, it's very inspiring, and I think Canada is a great example to be looked upon.
And what about you, coming from China?
Yes, I want to talk about female labor force participation. And in China, we have a high rate of female that is actually work. They have jobs and they work in this field. But as for senior level, it's not that good. We will face things like they fear of courage, they don't have that much devotion to their job. We will face these kind of things. So I will say that it's not enough yet about the gender equality. We have to do more to help them like get more promotion, face the glass ceiling problems here.
Not just have the cracks, but totally destroy them.
Well said.
Yeah. What about from Germany? I mean, Chancellor Merkel, excellent leader, but her wardrobe has been receiving the most criticism. Is that fair for a female leader? Are they being picked up on some of the minor details?
I have to say, regarding to the clothing question, this is something that we've actually seen also with the election of, not the election, but the appointment of Theresa May as Prime Minister, media commenting on the color of her shoes. And I thought, have we ever commented on the cut of, I don't know, Putin's suits? No, we haven't. So I think...
Not even as a compliment? You wouldn't agree?
I'm not going to comment because I don't think that this has anything to do with politics. I think that this, for example, is just one of the very, and compared to other things, very minor difficulties that female leaders face. And
can we change that?
Yes. Yes. By creating awareness, by supporting girls like us.
I would say that one of the ways to stop looking at women's wardrobes and shoes and haircuts and pantsuits is to have the media stop asking the question. Why is it relevant?
But it's proud to be beautiful.
Oh, there's nothing wrong with being beautiful, but the manner in which it's asked. So the question is asked about what she's wearing before what she's saying. If you want to ask her what she's saying and what she's doing, and then say, oh, by the way, what's the color of your whatever, then go for it. But why don't you put the important stuff first? I think that there is a really big responsibility on the side of media, and I think the media does take it seriously. There's nothing wrong with being feminine and pretty, but we're smart and we're driven.
Exactly,
and that should be first.
And that should be first. That should be the priority people are looking at. Having said that, though, sometimes people, especially women, are afraid of being labeled as superwomen. Women are afraid of being labeled as quote-unquote feminist. Well, it's up to interpretation as to your interpretation of what feminist is. But what do you make of this social trends in a way? It goes parallel with the rise of stronger women. That there has been, concerns that they don't want to be labeled as strong women. So that's a very interesting phenomenon to me. I don't know, what is your take on this?
I think feminist over the years has had a little bit of a negative connotation. I think unfairly so. For me, feminism just means the equality between men and women. But I think to combat this stigma, people like ourselves, men, leaders, need to stand up and declare themselves a feminist and destigmatize the word.
What about from your perspective? Stronger women, super women, feminists, these are all labels. Should we have the labels or should we not have the labels?
What do labels do? Labels put people in boxes that they don't necessarily have to be in. Many years ago, somebody said to me, are you a feminist? And I said, why don't you tell me first what your definition of feminism is? And then I'll answer the question. Because as Pippa says, there's a lot of baggage around the word. I would rather not be seen as a short brown woman who is a refugee from Uganda who lives in Canada who's got Indian heritage, but it's part of who I am. But that's the whole picture of who I am. It's not just one thing. So I think when you start to label people, you limit their potential to be something other than what you say they are. I am a very, very proud Canadian. I am a very proud Ugandan. I'm a very proud Indian. But most of all, I'm proud of the work that I do and the manner in which I do it. Right. I don't have to be called a feminist to do it. I don't have to not be called a feminist to do it.
Great ideas and also great questions. Thank you so much, ladies, for being with us. All the best. All the best. Let's make the world better. Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Farah Mohammed, the organizer and CEO of G20 Summit, and delegates from China, Canada, and Germany sharing their passion and their expectations for the G20 Summit. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone from the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.